Captain Reed Thornberry's voice cut across the ballroom entrance like a blade meant to wound. Sir, this event is for military families only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The old man's hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. Not from fear, never from fear, from something the young captain could not possibly understand. What Captain Thornberry did not know, what no one in that glittering ballroom yet realized, was that in exactly 40 minutes he would be on his knees with tears streaming down his face, begging forgiveness from a man whose trembling hands had once held steady enough to save 32 American lives in a single night of hell that history had nearly forgotten. The Grand Americana Hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and pressed uniforms. A sea of brass and ribbons gathered to celebrate the newest generation of Army officers. Flags hung crisp against wood-paneled walls. Families clutched programs and cameras. And at the entrance, beneath an archway of red, white, and blue bunting, Vernon Calloway stood frozen in his brown suit that hung 2 sizes too large on his diminished frame. He had lost weight since Martha passed. The suit had fit once, back when his hands were steady and his wife would straighten his tie before church. Now the fabric pulled at his shoulders and bunched at his wrists, revealing liver-spotted skin that would not stop shaking no matter how hard he willed it to be still. Captain Thornberry stepped closer, his West Point ring catching the chandelier light as he gestured dismissively toward the street. Sir, I need you to move along. This ceremony is by invitation only. His voice carried, designed to be heard by the well-dressed families passing through the registration tables behind him. Vernon's mouth opened, but the words came slow, tangled by age and the overwhelming noise of the ballroom. He had not been around this many people in years. The assisted living facility was quiet. His room was quiet. The cemetery where he visited Martha every Sunday morning was quieter still. My granddaughter, he managed finally. His voice emerged soft and rough from disuse. She is being commissioned today. Elena Calloway. Thornberry's eyes swept Vernon from his orthopedic shoes to his thinning white hair and found nothing worth respecting. The old man's hands shook so violently that the tremors traveled up his arms and into his shoulders. His suit was outdated by decades. His tie was crooked in a way that suggested no one had helped him dress this morning. He looked confused, lost, possibly senile. Sir, Thornberry said, and the word carried no respect whatsoever. I find that difficult to believe. Second Lieutenant Calloway comes from a distinguished military family. I have met her parents. They did not mention anything about a grandfather attending today. The word struck Vernon like shrapnel. He knew Thomas and Linda had not mentioned him. He knew they were embarrassed by what he had become, by his tremors, by his silence, by the way he shuffled now instead of walked. He had not blamed them for keeping their distance. He had kept his own distance for 40 years. Before we continue with Vernon's story, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or country. You might have a quiet hero in your own family whose sacrifices have never been fully recognized. Someone whose trembling hands tell a story that words never could. Now, let us continue. I have an invitation, Vernon said. He reached into his jacket pocket with fingers that would not cooperate. The paper was in there. Elena had mailed it to him 3 weeks ago with a handwritten note that read, "Please come, Grandpa. It would mean everything to me. Please." He had read that note 47 times. He had it memorized. He had almost not come anyway. His fingers found the envelope, but the tremors made it impossible to grip. The invitation slipped and fluttered toward the marble floor. Vernon bent to retrieve it with the slow, painful motion of a body that had carried too much weight for too many years. His knees protested. His back screamed. His hands shook so badly against the floor that he could not pick up the paper. Thornberry watched without offering help. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Around them, other families streamed past, some glancing at the spectacle with uncomfortable expressions before hurrying toward the registration tables. "Sir," Thornberry said, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "perhaps you should go home. This clearly is not the place for you. You are making a scene." Vernon finally grasped the envelope and straightened slowly, his joints popping in the silence that followed Thornberry's pronouncement. He held out the invitation with both trembling hands, willing them to steady, failing completely. Thornberry snatched the paper with theatrical impatience. He examined it with narrowed eyes, searching for evidence of forgery or mistake. The invitation was genuine. Elena Calloway had indeed sent it, but the captain's expression did not soften. Anyone could have gotten their hands on this, Thornberry said. He waved the invitation dismissively. How do I know you did not find this in the trash somewhere? How do I know you're not just some confused old man who wandered in looking for a handout? Vernon's trembling hands curled slowly at his sides. Beneath his threadbare shirt, 2 sets of dog tags hung against his chest. One set bore his own name. The other bore the name of a 19-year-old boy from Ohio who had died with a radio clutched in his hands, calling in coordinates while his blood soaked into Vietnamese soil. Vernon touched his chest where the tags rested. They were cool against his palm. They steadied him the way nothing else could. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the automatic respect drilled into him 50 years ago, "I am not looking for a handout. I just want to see my granddaughter take her oath." Thornberry signaled to a young staff sergeant standing near the registration tables. "Sergeant, I need an escort for this gentleman. He appears to be confused about where he belongs." The staff sergeant approached reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to contradict the captain. He reached for Vernon's arm. "Sir," the sergeant said, almost apologetically, "if you will come with me." His hand closed around Vernon's forearm, and the old man did not resist. He had never been one to cause scenes. He had spent 40 years avoiding attention, avoiding questions, avoiding the weight of memories that came when people looked at him too closely. But as the sergeant gripped his arm, Vernon's sleeve rode up. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that moment, beneath the fluorescent lights of the Grand Americana Hotel, the edge of a faded tattoo became visible against weathered skin. A screaming eagle with wings spread wide. The emblem of the 101st Airborne Division. And beneath it, numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who knew. Coordinates. A date. And the ghosts of 32 men who had lived because Vernon Calloway's hands had refused to shake when it mattered most. The staff sergeant's grip loosened slightly as his eyes caught the ink beneath Vernon's sleeve. Something flickered across his young face. Recognition, perhaps, or confusion. But before he could look closer, Captain Thornberry stepped between them with the impatience of a man who had already made up his mind. "That is enough," Thornberry said. He took the invitation and tucked it into his own pocket as though confiscating evidence. "I will hold on to this until we verify its authenticity. Sergeant, please escort this gentleman to the lobby. He can wait there while we sort this out." Vernon did not protest. He had stopped protesting decades ago. Somewhere between the rice paddies and the hospitals and the long silent years that followed, he had learned that some battles were not worth fighting. That sometimes the strongest thing a man could do was endure. The sergeant guided him toward a bench in the hotel lobby, away from the ballroom's golden light. Vernon lowered himself onto the cold marble seat with the careful movements of a man whose body had become a stranger to him. His hands continued their relentless trembling against his thighs. Through the open ballroom doors, he could hear the murmur of families finding their seats, the shuffle of programs, the bright laughter of young officers about to begin their careers. Somewhere in that room, Elena was sitting in the front row, waiting to have her name called, waiting to take an oath that Vernon himself had taken 53 years ago in a different world entirely. He closed his eyes, and the memories came whether he wanted them or not. January 1968. The air had smelled of smoke and copper, and something else that Vernon had later learned was the particular scent of a city dying. Hugh City had been beautiful once. French colonial architecture, temples with curved roofs, gardens that exploded with color even in winter. But by the time Vernon's platoon arrived, beauty had become irrelevant. The Tet Offensive had turned the city into a slaughterhouse. His hands had not trembled then, not once. Not when Lieutenant Patterson caught a round through the throat in the first 5 minutes of the ambush. Now when Vernon found himself suddenly in command of 43 terrified men with enemy fire coming from 3 directions. Now when he realized that the building they had taken cover in was surrounded and that no relief was coming until dawn. 38 hours. That was how long they held that position. 38 hours of hell, with the walls crumbling around them and the ammunition running low and the wounded crying out for medics who were already dead. Vernon opened his eyes. The hotel lobby materialized around him, all marble and crystal and soft music playing from hidden speakers. So different from the rubble and screaming. So impossibly far from the boy he had been. His hand moved automatically to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his shirt. 2 sets. His own, worn smooth by 50 years of contact with his skin. And another set, still carrying traces of blood in the grooves of the stamped letters, no matter how many times he had tried to clean them. Corporal Elias James Drummond. Blood type O positive. Methodist. 19 years old forever. Elias had been his radio man. A skinny kid from Columbus with a girl back home and plans to become a history teacher when his tour ended. He had a laugh that could cut through any tension and hands that never fumbled on a radio dial, not even when bullets were chewing through the walls around him. Vernon remembered the exact moment those hands had gone still. The RPG had come from a window they had cleared twice. Vernon had seen the flash, had started to shout a warning. But Elias had seen it too, and instead of diving for cover, the boy had stepped directly into Vernon's path. The blast had thrown them both against the far wall. Vernon had crawled to Elias through the dust and debris, had gathered the boy in his arms while blood pumped from the wound in his chest. The shrapnel had torn through his vest like paper, severed the femoral artery. There was nothing anyone could have done. But Elias had not let go of the radio. Even dying, he had kept transmitting, calling in coordinates for the air support that would not arrive for another 6 hours. Did they make it out? Elias had whispered, his voice already fading. Tell me they made it out. Vernon had held him tighter, had lied with all the conviction he could muster. They made it out. Every one of them. I swear. Elias had smiled, and then he was gone. Vernon had carried that lie for 50 years. Carried it along with the dog tags and the guilt and the knowledge that 7 men had not made it out. 7 men whose names he recited every night before sleep. 7 men who visited him in dreams that left him gasping and shaking in his narrow bed at the assisted living facility. But 32 men had survived. 32 men had gone home to wives and children and lives that stretched out before them like gifts. Because Vernon's hands had not trembled. Because he had crossed that open courtyard 7 times under direct fire, dragging wounded men to cover. Because he had held the line when everyone else had given up. The Medal of Honor nomination had been submitted 3 weeks after the battle. Vernon had never followed up on it. The paperwork had been lost somewhere in the chaos of 1968, and he had not mourned its disappearance. He did not deserve medals. He had lost 7 men. He had watched Elias die in his arms. What kind of hero let that happen? His hands trembled violently now, shaking against his thighs in the hotel lobby. The doctor said it was Parkinson's disease, made worse by Agent Orange exposure during his 2 tours. His body was finally betraying him the way he felt it should have decades ago. Martha had understood. Martha had held those trembling hands every night for 46 years of marriage, had kissed his scarred knuckles, and told him that shaking hands were nothing to be ashamed of. She had known about Vietnam, even though he had never spoken of it directly. She had known about the nightmares and the guilt and the weight he carried. And she had loved him anyway. When she died 6 years ago, the last person who truly knew him had vanished from the world. Vernon pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket with shaking fingers. Inside, protected by a plastic sleeve, was a photograph of Elena as a baby. Martha had taken that picture on the day they first held their granddaughter. Vernon's hands had trembled even then, but Elena had gripped his finger with her tiny fist and had not let go. She had asked him to come today. She had sent an invitation and a handwritten note and had called twice to make sure he received it. Please come, Grandpa. It will mean everything to me. Please. He had almost said no. He had almost stayed in his room at the assisted living facility watching the ceremony through a window in his mind the way he had watched so many of Elena's milestones from a distance. He was embarrassed by his tremors, embarrassed by the way people looked at him, embarrassed to be the grandfather who could not hold a coffee cup without spilling. But Martha's voice had echoed in his memory. As clear as the day, she had spoken the words. Tell her someday, Vernon. She deserves to know who her grandfather really was. He had never told Elena. He had never told anyone. The medal sat in a box in his closet, untouched for 4 decades. The citations had yellowed. The memories had calcified into something he carried but never examined. But today he had put on his old brown suit. He had knotted his crooked tie with trembling fingers. He had taken a taxi to the Grand Americana Hotel, and he had walked through those doors because his granddaughter had asked him to come. Now he sat on a cold marble bench in the lobby, exiled by a captain who saw nothing in him worth respecting. Through the ballroom doors, he could hear the ceremony beginning. The national anthem started to play, and Vernon's spine straightened automatically, muscle memory overriding the protests of his aging body. His hands, for just a moment, went completely still. The national anthem ended and Vernon's hands resumed their trembling as though a switch had been flipped. He remained on the marble bench, listening to the muffled sounds of the ceremony through the ballroom doors. Speeches had begun. He could hear the cadence of formal military oratory, even if he could not make out the words. Captain Thornberry emerged from the ballroom with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. He glanced at Vernon with undisguised contempt before turning his back and continuing his conversation. The staff sergeant who had escorted Vernon to the lobby stood awkwardly nearby, clearly uncertain whether he was supposed to be guarding the old man or simply waiting for further orders. Vernon did not acknowledge either of them. His eyes remained fixed on the sliver of ballroom visible through the open doors. Somewhere in there, Elena was waiting for her name to be called. Somewhere in there, his granddaughter was about to become an officer in the United States Army. The irony was not lost on him. 53 years ago, he had stood in a very different room, taking the same oath Elena would take today. He had been young and strong, and certain that his hands would never fail him. He had believed in things back then. Honor, duty, the unshakable conviction that right would prevail if good men stood firm. Vietnam had burned those certainties to ash, but had not burned his sense of duty. That had survived everything. That was why he was here. Thornberry ended his call and strode toward Vernon with renewed purpose. The captain's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor with the precise rhythm of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He stopped directly in front of the bench, forcing Vernon to look up at him. I have spoken with the event coordinator, Thornberry announced. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man delivering a verdict. There is no record of you on the approved guest list. Second Lieutenant Calloway's parents submitted their family attendance roster 3 weeks ago. Your name was not included. Vernon absorbed this information without visible reaction. He had suspected as much. Thomas had made it clear years ago that he found his father-in-law's silence about his service embarrassing, that he wished Vernon would either share his war stories like other veterans or stop wearing dog tags that invited questions he refused to answer. The absence from the guest list was not surprising. It was simply confirmation of what Vernon already knew. My granddaughter invited me herself, Vernon said quietly. She sent me a personal invitation. You have it in your pocket. Thornberry patted his uniform jacket dismissively. This invitation proves nothing. For all I know, you intercepted mail intended for someone else. Confused elderly individuals do that sort of thing all the time. Several hotel guests had paused in the lobby now, watching the confrontation with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing something they knew was wrong but felt powerless to stop. A woman in a floral dress whispered to her husband. A young man in a suit pulled out his phone, though whether to record or simply to have something to look at was unclear. Thornberry noticed the attention and seemed to feed on it. He raised his voice slightly, performing now for the gathered witnesses. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave the premises voluntarily. If you refuse, I will have hotel security remove you. This is a dignified military ceremony, not a shelter for anyone who wanders in off the street. Vernon's trembling hands curled slowly on his thighs. Beneath his shirt, the dog tags pressed cold against his chest. Elias's tags. His own tags. 50 years of service and sacrifice reduced to this moment in a hotel lobby where a young captain saw nothing in him but weakness and confusion. He thought of the 7 men whose names he carried. Patterson, Drummond, Kowalski, Chun, Williams, Baker, Morrison. He thought of 32 who had made a home. He thought of the letters their families had sent him in the years after, letters he had never answered because he could not bear to accept their gratitude when their sons and brothers and fathers had survived while his own men had died. He thought of Martha, who had kept those letters in a box in their closet, who had read them aloud to him on the anniversaries when the weight became too heavy to carry alone. "I am not leaving," Vernon said. His voice remained soft, but something in it had changed. A thread of steel woven through the fabric of age and illness. "I told my granddaughter I would be here. I intend to keep that promise." Thornberry's face flushed with anger at the defiance. He stepped closer, looming over the seated old man with the physical advantage of youth and position. "Listen to me carefully," he said. His voice dropped to a hiss meant only for Vernon's ears. "I have seen 100 men like you. Men who buy dog tags at surplus stores and tell stories about wars they never fought. Men who use their fake service to get sympathy and handouts. You are not fooling anyone. Your trembling hands and your shabby suit and your pathetic act might work on civilians, but I am a United States Army officer. I know stolen valor when I see it." The accusation hung in the air between them. Stolen valor. The words struck Vernon like bullets, each one finding its mark in the center of his chest where the dog tags lay. He had never claimed valor. He had never spoken of his service to anyone except Martha. He had hidden his medals in a closet and refused interviews and declined invitations to reunions because he could not bear to be thanked for surviving when better men had died. And now this captain, this boy who had never heard a shot fired in anger, was accusing him of stealing what he had paid for in blood. Vernon's hands trembled violently, but when he looked up at Thornberry, his eyes were steady. "I am not leaving," he repeated. Thornberry straightened, his decision made. "Fine." He turned to the staff sergeant. "Sergeant, please escort this man to the street. If he resists, notify hotel security." The sergeant approached reluctantly. "Sir," he said to Vernon, his voice apologetic, "please, I do not want this to become a scene." Vernon rose slowly from a bench. His joints protested, and his legs shook beneath him, but he stood. He allowed the sergeant to take his arm again, to guide him toward the hotel entrance. But as they walked, something caught the sergeant's eye. The sleeve of Vernon's jacket had ridden up again, and this time the full tattoo was visible. Not just the edge of the screaming eagle, but the entire emblem of the 101st Airborne Division. The coordinates beneath it, and something else. A date, inked in faded blue numbers that had blurred with age but remained legible. January 31st, 68. The sergeant's pace slowed. His grip on Vernon's arm loosened. He knew that date. Every soldier who had studied Vietnam knew that date. It was the first day of the Tet Offensive. The day the war had changed forever. The day that heroes had been forged in blood and fire across 100 cities and villages throughout South Vietnam. "Sir," the sergeant said slowly. "That tattoo." Vernon said nothing. He had stopped trying to hide it years ago. The ink had become part of him, as permanent as the memories it represented. From across the lobby, another figure had noticed the exchange. Command Sergeant Major Darius Webb had been walking toward the ballroom when the commotion caught his attention. He was a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades in uniform. He served as senior enlisted advisor to Major General Vance, and he had made it his personal mission to study the history of every conflict American soldiers had fought. He saw the tattoo on Vernon's arm. He saw the coordinates. He saw the date, and his blood went cold. Webb changed direction, moving toward the old man and the sergeant with purpose in his stride. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong, because those coordinates were not random numbers chosen for decoration. Those coordinates marked the provincial headquarters in Hugh City. The building where 43 men had held out for 38 hours against impossible odds. The building that had become legend in the annals of Army history. And if this trembling old man had those coordinates tattooed on his arm, then Captain Thornberry had just made the worst mistake of his career. Command Sergeant Major Webb stopped 3 feet from Vernon, his eyes locked on the faded tattoo. The screaming eagle. The coordinates. The date that had changed everything for a generation of soldiers. His throat tightened as decades of military history crystallized into this single impossible moment in a hotel lobby. The staff sergeant still held Vernon's arm, frozen in confusion by Webb's sudden appearance. Captain Thornberry watched from near the ballroom doors with crossed arms and barely concealed impatience. "Sergeant Major," Thornberry called out, "I have this situation under control. This gentleman was just leaving." Webb did not acknowledge the captain. His attention remained fixed on Vernon, on the trembling hands and the stooped shoulders and the eyes that held something ancient and unbroken beneath the surface of age. "Sir," Webb said quietly, "that tattoo, those coordinates." Vernon met his gaze but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was easier than explanation, that the weight of what he carried could not be transferred through words. Webb's voice dropped lower, meant only for Vernon's ears. 16.46, 37 degrees north. 107.5909 degrees east. I know those numbers. I have studied them. That is the provincial headquarters in Hugh City. Vernon's trembling hands went still for just a moment. Then the shaking resumed, more violent than before. "You were there," Webb continued. "It was not a question. January 31st, 1968. First day of Tet." Vernon closed his eyes. The lobby disappeared. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers dissolved into smoke and screaming and the deafening roar of gunfire that had not stopped for 38 hours. He was back in that building. The walls were crumbling around him. Lieutenant Patterson lay dead near the doorway, his throat a ruin of torn flesh and arterial spray. 42 men were looking to Vernon for orders because he was suddenly the ranking soldier alive, and none of them knew what to do except him. "Hold the line," he had told them. His voice had not shaken. His hands had not trembled. "We hold until relief arrives. No one gets left behind." They had held. Through the night, and through the next day, and through another night while the ammunition ran low, and the wounded multiplied, and the NVA kept coming in waves that seemed endless. They had held because Vernon had refused to let them break. He opened his eyes. The hotel lobby materialized around him once more. Webb was still watching him with an expression Vernon had not seen in decades. Recognition. Reverence. The look of a man who understood exactly what he was seeing. "What unit?" Webb asked softly. Vernon's voice came out rough and barely audible. 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, Alpha Company." Webb took a step back. His hand moved unconsciously toward his chest in a gesture that was almost a salute. "The Rakkasans," he breathed. "You were with the Rakkasans at Hugh." From the ballroom doors, Thornberry's voice cut through the moment with irritation. "Sergeant Major Webb, I asked this man to leave. He is disrupting this ceremony." Webb turned slowly to face the captain. His expression had changed. The professional deference that junior officers expected from enlisted men had vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. "Captain Thornberry," Webb said. His voice carried the controlled fury of a man exercising enormous restraint. "I need you to release this gentleman's invitation immediately." Thornberry blinked in surprise. "Sergeant Major, with respect, this is not your concern. This man claims to be related to one of our new officers, but he is not on the approved guest list. He has no business here." Webb crossed the lobby with measured strides until he stood directly in front of the captain. Though Thornberry technically outranked him, there was no question in that moment who held the power. "The invitation," Webb repeated. "Now." Something in Webb's tone made Thornberry hesitate. He reached into his pocket and produced the crumpled envelope, holding it out with obvious reluctance. Webb took it and walked back to Vernon, who remained standing near the bench with the staff sergeant hovering uncertainly beside him. "Sir," Webb said, He handed Vernon the invitation with both hands, a gesture of respect that was not lost on the watching crowd. I apologize for any inconvenience you have experienced. Please allow me to escort you into the ceremony. Vernon looked at the invitation in his trembling hands. Elena's handwriting on the envelope. The promise he had made to be here. The 50 years of silence that had led to this moment. Thornberry stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. Sergeant Major, I must protest. We have no verification of this man's identity. Anyone could claim to be a veteran. Anyone could get a tattoo and pretend. Webb rounded on him with a fury that made the captain take an involuntary step backward. Pretend, Webb repeated. The word came out like a blade. Captain, do you know what those coordinates represent? Do you have any idea what happened at that location on January 31st, 1968? Thornberry's silence was answer enough. Webb's voice rose, no longer caring who heard. That location was the provincial headquarters in Hugh City. Alpha Company of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry held that building for 38 hours against the company strength NVA force. They were outnumbered 10-1. Their commanding officer was killed in the first 5 minutes. A sergeant took command and held the line until relief arrived. The lobby had gone quiet. Hotel guests and military families alike had stopped to listen. That sergeant crossed open ground under direct enemy fire 7 times to retrieve wounded men, Webb continued. 7 times. He was wounded 3 times himself and refused evacuation. He carried his radio man's body back to friendly lines after the boy died, calling in air support. Vernon's hands trembled violently. The memories crashed over him like waves. Elias's blood on his uniform. The weight of the boy's body across his shoulders. The promise he had made to a dying 19-year-old from Ohio. Did they make it out? Tell me they made it out. They made it out, Vernon had lied. Every one of them. I swear. But 7 had not made it out. 7 names he carried like stones in his chest. 7 men who had trusted him to bring them home. Webb was still speaking, his voice carrying across the silent lobby. That sergeant was nominated for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was lost in the chaos of 1968. He never followed up. He never sought recognition. He just went home and tried to live with what he had seen. Thornberry's face had gone pale. His earlier confidence had evaporated like morning fog. Webb turned back to Vernon. His eyes were bright with emotion. Sir, he said quietly, what was your call sign? Vernon looked at the sergeant major, at the young captain who had accused him of stolen valor, at the crowd of strangers who were witnessing this moment he had spent 50 years avoiding. His hands trembled. His voice shook. But when he spoke, the word came out clear and steady. Steadfast. Webb's breath caught. His hand rose to his forehead in a salute that had nothing to do with regulation and everything to do with reverence. The staff sergeant beside Vernon snapped to attention and saluted as well. And Captain Thornberry stood frozen, his face white as marble, as the magnitude of his mistake began to dawn on him. In the ballroom beyond, the ceremony continued. Names were being called. Oaths were being taken. And somewhere in the front row, Elena Calloway sat waiting for her turn, unaware that her grandfather was standing in the lobby with 50 years of silence finally breaking around him. The salutes held for a long moment in the hotel lobby. Webb's arm remained rigid at his forehead, his eyes fixed on Vernon with an intensity that seemed to reach across decades. The staff sergeant beside them maintained his own salute, his earlier reluctance transformed into something approaching awe. Vernon stood motionless, uncertain how to respond. He had not been saluted in 50 years. He had not allowed himself to be recognized or honored or thanked. The weight of the gesture pressed against his chest alongside the dog tags he had carried for half a century. At ease, he finally said. His voice came out hoarse and barely audible, but the words were automatic. Muscle memory from a lifetime ago. Webb lowered his arms slowly. The staff sergeant followed suit. Around them, the lobby remained frozen, hotel guests and military families watching a scene none of them fully understood. Thornberry had not moved. His face had drained of color, leaving him pale and rigid near the ballroom doors. His earlier arrogance had crumbled into something closer to fear. The stolen valor accusation hung in the air between them like a grenade with a pin already pulled. Webb turned to the captain with cold precision. "Sir, I believe you owe this man an apology." Thornberry's mouth opened, but no words emerged. His eyes darted between Webb and Vernon and the watching crowd, calculating the damage, searching for an exit that did not exist. Vernon raised a trembling hand. "No," he said quietly. "No apology necessary." Webb frowned. "Sir, with respect, what this officer said to you was inexcusable. He accused you of stolen valor. He tried to have you removed from your own granddaughter's commissioning ceremony." Vernon looked at Thornberry. The young captain stood paralyzed, his polished uniform and West Point ring suddenly meaningless in the face of what he had done. Vernon had seen that expression before. On the faces of young soldiers who had made mistakes in combat. On the faces of men who had learned too late that assumptions could be fatal. He did not know, Vernon said simply. Most people do not. The words carried no bitterness. No anger. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who had made peace with being invisible long ago. Webb shook his head in frustration, but did not press further. Instead, he stepped closer to Vernon and lowered his voice. "Sir, there is something I need to tell you. I have studied the Tet offensive extensively. I have read every after-action report from Hugh City. I know what happened at that provincial headquarters." Vernon's trembling hands curled at his sides. He did not want to hear this. Did not want the past dragged into the light of this marble lobby with its crystal chandeliers and soft music. But Webb continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know about the 7 times you crossed that courtyard. I know about the 38 hours without relief. I know about the wounded you carried and the line you held and the men who made it home because of you." Vernon closed his eyes. The names rose up unbidden. Patterson, Drummond, Kowalski, Chun, Williams, Baker, Morrison. 7 men who had not made it home. 7 men whose faces he saw every time he closed his eyes. "I also know," Webb said, "that you were nominated for the Medal of Honor. And I know the nomination was lost in the chaos after Tet. What I did not know, until this moment, was that you were still alive." Vernon opened his eyes. Still alive. The words echoed strangely in his mind. He had been still alive for 50 years. Still alive while better men rotted in graves across America and Vietnam. Still alive while Elias Drummond remained forever 19 in a cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. "Sir," Webb continued, "I need to ask you something. Will you let me escort you into the ceremony? Your granddaughter is about to be commissioned. You should be there when it happens." Vernon looked toward the ballroom doors. Through the gap, he could see rows of chairs and the edge of a stage draped with flags. Somewhere in there, Elena was waiting. Elena, who had sent him an invitation with a handwritten note. Elena, who had begged him to come. Elena, who had no idea what her grandfather had done or what he had lost or why his hands would not stop shaking. He had planned to watch from the back, to slip in unnoticed and slip out before anyone could ask questions, to keep his silence intact for another day, another year, however long he had left. But Webb was watching him with those knowing eyes, and the staff sergeant was standing at attention like Vernon was someone worth honoring. And even Thornberry, pale and trembling in his own way now, was staring at him with something that might have been the beginning of shame. Vernon thought of Martha, of the box of letters in their closet from families of men he had saved, of her voice asking him to tell their granddaughter the truth before it was too late. Tell her someday, Vernon. She deserves to know who her grandfather really was. He had never found the courage, had never found the words, had never believed he deserved to be remembered as anything other than what he saw in the mirror each morning. An old man with trembling hands and a suit that no longer fit and a lifetime of silence wrapped around him like a shroud. But Elena had asked him to come. She had written please twice in her note. "Please come, Grandpa. It would mean everything to me. Please." And he had promised. Vernon straightened his shoulders. The movement was slow and painful, his spine protesting after years of being hunched against the weight of memory. But something in his bearing shifted. Something that had been dormant for decades stirred beneath the surface of age and illness. The staff sergeant noticed it first, the way Vernon's chin lifted, the way his trembling hands stilled for just a moment at his sides, the way his eyes focused with sudden clarity on the ballroom doors. It was a small thing, a subtle thing, but it was enough to make the sergeant catch his breath. Because for just an instant, the trembling old man in the ill-fitting brown suit had disappeared, and something else had taken his place. "Yes," Vernon said. His voice was quiet but steady. "Take me to my granddaughter." Webb nodded once and offered his arm. Vernon hesitated, then accepted the support. Together, they began walking toward the ballroom doors. Thornberry stepped aside to let them pass. His earlier arrogance had vanished completely, replaced by a dawning horror at what he had done. His career flashed before his eyes. His reputation, everything he had worked for. But Vernon did not even glance at him as he walked by. He had more important things to focus on now. In the ballroom beyond, the ceremony continued, and Elena Calloway's name was next on the list. The ballroom opened before Vernon like a cathedral of brass and ceremony. Rows of chairs stretched toward a stage where American flags hung in solemn arrangement behind a wooden podium. Hundreds of faces turned as Webb guided him through the rear entrance, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion at the sight of the elderly man in the oversized brown suit being escorted by a command sergeant major. Vernon kept his eyes forward. His hands trembled at his sides, but his steps remained steady, supported by Webb's firm grip on his arm. The soft carpet muffled their footsteps as they moved along the back wall toward an empty seat. On stage, a colonel was reading names from a leather-bound folder. Each name was followed by applause as young officers rose from the front rows to receive their commissions. The ceremony had the practiced rhythm of tradition, each movement choreographed by decades of repetition. "Elena Calloway," the colonel announced. Vernon stopped walking. His breath caught in his chest. From the front row, a young woman in dress uniform stood and walked toward the stage. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her shoulders were squared with the precision of someone who had trained for this moment. She moved with a confidence that reminded Vernon of Martha on their wedding day, that same quiet certainty that the world would arrange itself around her determination. His granddaughter, his Elena, the baby whose photograph he had carried for 23 years, was now a soldier. Webb felt Vernon's arm tense and stopped beside him. They stood against the back wall, partially hidden by a column, watching as Elena climbed the stairs to the stage. The colonel administered the oath. Elena's voice rang clear through the ballroom, each word crisp and deliberate. "I, Elena Marie Calloway, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Vernon's lips moved silently, forming the same words. He had spoken them 53 years ago in a cramped office at Fort Benning with a sergeant who smelled of cigarettes and impatience. He had meant every syllable then. He meant them still. "That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same." His trembling hands rose unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his shirt. Elias had taken this oath too. So had Patterson and Kowalski and all the others whose names Vernon carried like stones. They had sworn to defend the Constitution, and they had died doing exactly that, in a city most Americans could not find on a map, for reasons that history would argue about for generations. "That I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of the officers appointed over me." Elena's voice did not waver. Vernon watched her face, searching for traces of Martha in the curve of her jaw, traces of himself in the steadiness of her gaze. She was beautiful and strong, and completely unaware that her grandfather stood 30 feet behind her with 50 years of secrets pressing against his ribs, according to regulations and a uniform code of military justice. So help me God. The ballroom erupted in applause. Elena saluted the colonel, received her commission folder, and turned to face the audience with a smile that made Vernon's heart crack open in his chest. She scanned the crowd, looking for her parents in the reserved family section. Her mother, Linda, was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Her father, Thomas, was applauding with the stiff enthusiasm of a man who believed military service was respectable but had never quite understood it. Elena's eyes continued searching, looking for someone else, looking for the grandfather who had promised to come. Vernon wanted to raise his hand, wanted to call out to her, wanted to bridge the distance between them with something more than trembling silence. But his voice would not come, and his legs would not move, and the weight of decades pressed him against the column like a physical force. Webb leaned close to his ear. "Sir, do you want me to get her attention?" Vernon shook his head. "Not yet. Not like this. Not with hundreds of strangers watching and questions he was not ready to answer." Elena's smile flickered with disappointment as she failed to locate him in the crowd. She returned to her seat in the front row, her commission folder clutched against her chest like a shield. Vernon exhaled slowly. His hands trembled more violently now, the Parkinsons responding to the emotional surge with cruel intensity. He had come. He had kept his promise. He had watched her take the oath that bound her to the same duty that had shaped his entire life. But he had not let her see him, had not let her know he was here, had hidden in the shadows like he had hidden for years, watching her graduations and birthdays and achievements from distances that kept his trembling hands invisible. Webb was watching him with an expression Vernon could not read. Something between sympathy and frustration flickered in the sergeant major's eyes. "She was looking for you," Webb said quietly. Vernon nodded. He had seen her searching, had felt the familiar knife of cowardice twist in his gut. The ceremony continued. More names were called. More oaths were administered. Vernon remained frozen against the back wall, caught between the desire to step forward and the terror of what that step would require. Then something changed. Near the stage, a commotion rippled through the front rows. An aide had approached Major General Vance, who sat in the VIP section awaiting his turn to deliver the keynote address. The aide leaned close, whispering urgently in the general's ear. Vance's expression shifted. His eyebrows rose. He turned in his seat, scanning the back of the ballroom with sudden intensity. His eyes found Vernon. For a long moment, the general simply stared. Then he rose from his seat, straightening his uniform jacket with the deliberate movements of a man who had just received unexpected orders. Webb stiffened beside Vernon. "Sir," he said, "I believe the general is coming this way." Vernon watched Vance excuse himself from the VIP section and begin walking up the center aisle. Heads turned to follow his progress. Whispers cascaded through the audience like wind through tall grass. The ceremony on stage faltered as even the colonel noticed the unusual movement. The next name on the list went uncalled as all attention shifted to the major general striding toward the back of the ballroom. Toward Vernon. Thornberry had entered through a side door and now stood pale and rigid near the wall, watching the disaster he had created unfold in slow motion. His phone call to verify Vernon's identity had clearly reached higher than expected. Much higher. Webb stepped slightly in front of Vernon, a protective gesture that was almost instinctive. But Vernon gently pushed past him. If the general was coming, Vernon would meet him standing. His hands trembled violently as he straightened his crooked tie and lifted his chin. The soldier who had held the line for 38 hours was still in there somewhere, buried beneath decades of silence and shame. It was time to stop hiding. Major General Harrison Vance moved up the center aisle with the measured stride of a man who had commanded soldiers in 3 different wars. His chest was heavy with ribbons, and his silver hair caught the chandelier light as he walked. Behind him, the ceremony had ground to a halt. The colonel on stage stood frozen at the podium, the next name on his list forgotten. Every eye in the ballroom followed the general's progress toward the back wall, where Vernon stood trembling beside the marble column. Vernon watched him approach. His hands shook at his sides, and his heart hammered against his ribs, but he did not look away. He had spent 50 years avoiding moments like this. 50 years declining reunions and refusing interviews and hiding from the recognition he believed he did not deserve. But he could not hide anymore. Not with a 2-star general walking toward him. Not with his granddaughter sitting in the front row. Not with the weight of 32 saved lives and 7 lost souls pressing against his chest. General Vance stopped 3 feet from Vernon. The ballroom had fallen completely silent. Even the rustle of programs and the whisper of fabric had ceased. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting to understand what they were witnessing. Vance studied Vernon for a long moment. His eyes took in the oversized brown suit and the crooked tie and the trembling hands that would not be still. Then his gaze dropped to Vernon's chest, to the slight bulge where dog tags hung beneath the threadbare shirt. "Master Sergeant Vernon Calloway," Vance said. His voice carried through the silent ballroom, without amplification. "Call sign steadfast." Vernon's throat tightened. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in decades, had not allowed anyone close enough to learn it. The word hung in the air between them like a ghost finally given form. "Sir," Vernon managed. His voice came out rough and barely audible. Vance's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes that Vernon recognized. The look of a man confronting history made flesh. "My father served in Vietnam," Vance said. "He was a lieutenant with the 1st Cavalry Division. I Drang Valley in 1965. He came home with a silver star and nightmares that never stopped." Vernon nodded slightly. He understood nightmares. He had lived with them for 50 years. "When I was a boy," Vance continued, "my father used to tell me stories about the war. Not his own stories. He never talked about himself. But he told me about other men. Men whose actions had become legend among those who served." The general's voice grew quieter, more intimate, though it still carried through the silent room. One of his favorite stories was about a sergeant at Hugh City, a man who took command when his lieutenant was killed in the first minutes of an ambush, who held a building for 38 hours against a force that should have overwhelmed him in the first 38 minutes. Vernon's trembling hands curled into fists at his sides. The memories crashed over him. The smell of cordite and blood. The screaming that never seemed to stop. Elias's face, pale and peaceful in death, his hands still clutching the radio. "My father said this sergeant crossed open ground under direct fire 7 times to retrieve wounded men," Vance said. "He said the sergeant was wounded 3 times himself and refused evacuation. He said when relief finally arrived, the sergeant was still on his feet, still holding the line, still refusing to leave his men." Vernon closed his eyes. He could hear the helicopters now, the blessed thunder of rotors that had meant salvation was finally coming. He could feel the exhaustion that had nearly buckled his knees when he finally allowed himself to stop moving. "My father told me that Sargent was nominated for the Medal of Honor," Vance said. "He told me the nomination was lost in the chaos after Tet. And he told me that the sergeant never followed up, never sought recognition, just went home and disappeared." Vernon opened his eyes. Vance was watching him with an expression that held no judgment, only understanding. "My father looked for you," Vance said quietly. "For years, he tried to find out what happened to the sergeant from Hugh City. He wanted to thank you. He had friends who survived that building because of what you did." Vernon's voice cracked when he spoke. "I was not hard to find." "No," Vance agreed. "You were not. But you did not want to be found. And my father respected that, even though he never understood it." The silence stretched between them. Around the ballroom, people remained frozen in their seats, witnesses to a moment none of them had expected. In the front row, Elena Calloway had turned completely around her chair. Her commission folder lay forgotten in her lap. She was staring at the old man in the brown suit, the man the general was addressing with such reverence. Confusion and dawning recognition warred across her face. Vernon saw her looking. Their eyes met across the length of the ballroom. She knew. She did not know the details yet, did not know the full scope of what her grandfather had done and lost. But she knew that something was happening, something that mattered. Vernon wanted to go to her, wanted to cross that distance and take her hands and tell her everything he had kept hidden for so long. But his legs would not move. His voice would not come. The weight of 50 years pressed him to the floor like gravity doubled. Vance seemed to sense his paralysis. The general glanced toward Elena, then back at Vernon. "Is that your granddaughter?" he asked quietly. "The new lieutenant." Vernon nodded. The movement felt like surrender. "She looks like a fine officer," Vance said. You must be very proud. Vernon's trembling hands uncurled. He looked at Elena, at the confusion and hope tangled together on her young face, and something inside him shifted. I am, he said. His voice was still rough, still barely audible, but the words came easier now. I am proud. Vance studied him for another long moment. Then he did something that made the entire ballroom gasp. He snapped to attention. His hand rose to his forehead in a crisp salute. His eyes locked on Vernon with the focus of a soldier honoring a superior. Master Sergeant Calloway, Vance said. His voice rang through the silent room. It is my honor to finally meet you. Vernon stared at the general, at the 2 stars on his shoulders, at the salute being rendered to a trembling old man in a suit that did not fit. His body remembered what to do even when his mind resisted. His spine straightened, his chin lifted, his trembling right hand rose slowly to his forehead. The salute was imperfect. His hand shook violently against his brow. His fingers would not quite align, but he held it the way he had held that line 50 years ago, through sheer force of will. And in the front row, Elena Calloway rose from her seat with tears streaming down her face. Elena pushed past the officers seated beside her, her eyes fixed on the back of the ballroom where her grandfather stood with his trembling hands still raised in salute. Her commission folder tumbled to the floor unnoticed. Her carefully pinned hair began to loosen as she moved. None of it mattered. Grandpa, she called out. Her voice cracked on the word. Vernon lowered his hand as General Vance dropped his salute. The trembling returned immediately, his fingers shaking against his thigh as though the effort of holding still had exhausted some vital reserve. Elena was coming toward him. His granddaughter, the baby whose photograph he had traced with trembling fingers for 23 years, was pushing through rows of chairs and uniformed officers to reach him. And he could not move, could not go to her, could only stand frozen as she closed the distance between them. The ballroom remained silent except for Elena's footsteps and the rustle of her uniform. Every face was turned toward the scene unfolding at the back of the room. Phones had appeared in hands throughout the audience, recording what no one yet fully understood. Captain Thornberry stood rigid against the side wall, his face the color of chalk. His earlier accusations echoed in his memory like gunfire. Stolen valor. Confused old man. Pathetic act. Each word returned to him now with the weight of catastrophe. Elena reached Vernon and stopped. She was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the emotions crashing through her chest. Her eyes swept over his face, searching for the grandfather she had known in the grandfather she was only now beginning to see. I do not understand, she said. Her voice trembled almost as badly as his hands. What is happening? Why did the general salute you? Why did he call you Master Sergeant? Vernon opened his mouth, but the words would not come. 50 years of silence had calcified in his throat, blocking everything he wanted to say. Webb stepped forward, his voice gentle but clear. Lieutenant Calloway, your grandfather served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division. He was at Hugh City during the Tet Offensive. He is one of the most decorated soldiers of that conflict. Elena stared at Webb, then back at Vernon. Her hand rose to her mouth. You never told me, she whispered. All these years, all those times I asked about your service. You said you did not want to talk about it. You said it was a long time ago. Vernon found his voice at last. It was rough and broken, barely recognizable as his own. I do not know how, he said. I did not know how to tell you about the things I saw, the things I did, the men I lost. Elena's eyes filled with fresh tears. She reached out and took his trembling hands in her own, steadying them the way Martha used to do. The contact was warm and firm, and so unexpected that Vernon nearly buckled. You lost men, Elena said softly. That is what you have been carrying all this time. That is why you never talked about it. Vernon nodded. The movement felt like confession. 7, he said. The word came out ragged. I lost 7 men at Hugh City. 7 boys who trusted me to bring them home. And I have carried their names every day since. Elena squeezed his hands tighter. Her grip was strong, stronger than he expected from someone so young. The grip of a soldier. But you saved others, she said. The general said you saved men. How many, Grandpa? How many did you bring home? Vernon could not answer. The number stuck in his throat alongside the names of the dead. 32, Webb said quietly. He saved 32 men that day, carried most of them to safety himself under direct enemy fire. Elena's breath caught. She looked at her grandfather with new eyes, seeing him perhaps for the first time. Not the trembling old man who shuffled and shook and kept his distance at family gatherings, but the soldier who had walked through fire to save his brothers. "Why did you never tell us?" she asked. "Why did you hide this?" Vernon looked at his granddaughter, at her uniform and her lieutenant's bars, and the tears streaming down her face. She was everything he and Martha had hoped she would become, strong and brave and committed to something larger than herself. "Because I was ashamed," he said finally. His voice cracked on the word. "I lost 7 men, Elena. 7 men died because I was not fast enough, not smart enough, not good enough to save them all." Elena shook her head fiercely. "No," she said. "No, Grandpa. You're not hearing what everyone is saying. You saved 32 lives. You held a building for 38 hours. You were nominated for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was lost," Vernon said automatically. The excuse he had used for 50 years. The shield he had hidden behind. "But you never followed up," Elena pressed. "You never tried to get recognition." "Why?" Vernon was silent for a long moment. The ballroom waited, hundreds of strangers bearing witness to a conversation that should have happened decades ago in a quiet living room. "Because I did not deserve it," Vernon said at last. His voice was barely a whisper. "The men who died deserved it. Elias Drummond, my radio man. He took a bullet meant for me. He died calling in air support with his last breath. He deserved the medal, not me." He reached beneath his shirt with trembling fingers and pulled out the dog tags. 2 sets, hanging together on a single chain. One worn smooth by 50 years of contact with his skin. The other still bearing traces of blood that would never fully wash away. "These are his tags," Vernon said. "Elias's mother gave them to me at his funeral. She said he wanted to have them. She said I was like a brother to him." Elena looked at the tags, at the names stamped into metal that had hung against her grandfather's heart for half a century. "You have been carrying him all this time," she said softly. Vernon nodded. "Him and the others. Every day, every night. I cannot let them go." General Vance had moved closer during the exchange. He stood a respectful distance away, but his eyes were fixed on the dog tags in Vernon's trembling hands. "Master Sergeant," Vance said quietly, "those men you lost, they would not want you to carry this guilt forever. They would want you to live, to find peace, to let your family know who you really are." Vernon looked at the general, then at his granddaughter, then at the hundreds of faces watching from the ballroom seats. He had hidden for 50 years, had wrapped himself in silence like a shroud, had let the tremors in his hands become an excuse to fade into the background of his own life. But Elena was holding his hands now. Elena was looking at him with love and awe and grief all tangled together. Elena had asked him to come today, had written please twice in her note, and he had promised. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let them all know. General Vance turned to face the ballroom. His voice carried with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention in far more hostile environments than a hotel ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I apologize for the interruption to our program, but I believe what is happening here today is more important than any speech I was prepared to give." The audience remained motionless, phones still recording, eyes fixed on the tableau at the back of the room. The colonel on stage had set down his leather folder and was watching with undisguised fascination. Vance gestured toward Vernon. "This man is Master Sergeant Vernon Calloway, United States Army, retired. Call sign Steadfast. He served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. And on January 31st, 1968, the first day of the Tet Offensive, he performed actions that have become legend among those who study that conflict." Vernon stood frozen, with Elena still holding his trembling hands. The dog tags hung outside his shirt now, catching the chandelier light. 2 sets of metal. 2 names. 50 years of silence finally breaking open. Vance continued, his voice filling the ballroom. When his platoon was ambushed in Hugh City, Sergeant Calloway assumed command after his lieutenant was killed. He led 42 men in a defensive action that lasted 38 hours against a vastly superior enemy force. He was wounded 3 times and refused evacuation. He crossed open ground under direct fire 7 times to retrieve wounded soldiers and carry them to safety. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone in the middle rows whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough to be heard. 32 men survived that battle because of Sergeant Calloway's actions, Vance said. 32 men went home to their families. Many of them are grandfathers now themselves. Some of them may be watching ceremonies just like this one today, watching their own grandchildren take the oath, never knowing that the man who saved their lives has spent 50 years in silence. Elena's grip on Vernon's hands tightened. Tears streamed freely down her face now, cutting tracks through her carefully applied makeup. Vernon looked at his granddaughter and saw Martha looking back at him. The same fierce love, the same stubborn refusal to let him disappear into his own guilt. Sergeant Calloway was nominated for the Medal of Honor, Vance continued. The nomination was lost in the administrative chaos that followed the Tet Offensive. He never followed up. He never sought recognition. He simply went home and tried to live with what he had experienced. The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "I have been informed," Vance said, "that earlier today, Sergeant Calloway was accused of stolen valor by an officer who saw only an old man with trembling hands in a suit that did not fit. He was nearly removed from his own granddaughter's commissioning ceremony." A ripple of outrage moved through the audience. Heads turned, searching for the officer responsible. Thornberry pressed himself further against the wall, wishing he could dissolve into the wallpaper. "That officer was wrong," Vance said simply, "and I suspect he knows that now." Vernon found his voice at last. It emerged rough and unsteady, but it carried. "General," he said, "with respect, I did not come here for recognition. I came here for her." He looked at Elena, at the lieutenant's bars on her shoulders, at the tears on her face and the strength in her grip. "I came here because she asked me to," Vernon continued, "because she sent me an invitation and wrote please twice, and I made a promise. I have broken too many promises in my life. I did not want to break this one." Elena released one of his hands and touched his face. Her palm was warm against his weathered cheek. "You came," she said softly. "That is all that matters. You came." Vernon shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It is not all that matters. I should have told you. I should have told you years ago. Your grandmother wanted me to. She asked me so many times. Tell her, Vernon. She deserves to know." He paused, struggling to force the next words past the blockage in his throat. "But I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you would look at me differently. Afraid you would ask questions I did not know how to answer. Afraid you would see me as something I do not believe I am." Elena shook her head fiercely. "What do you not believe you are?" Vernon's trembling hands curled into fists at his sides. "A hero," he said. The word came out like a confession. "I'm not a hero, Elena. Heroes do not let 7 men die. Heroes do not spend 50 years hiding from their own families. Heroes do not shake and shuffle and wear suits that do not fit." The ballroom was absolutely silent. Even the air seemed to have stopped moving. Elena stepped closer to her grandfather. She was almost as tall as him now, the height she had inherited from her grandmother. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that reminded him of the moment he had decided to hold the line at Hugh City. "Listen to me," she said. Her voice was quiet but fierce. "I have studied military history for 4 years. I have read about battles and strategies and the men who fought them. Do you know what separates the real heroes from the legends and textbooks?" Vernon shook his head. "The real heroes never think they are heroes," Elena said. "The real heroes carry guilt instead of pride. They remember the ones they lost instead of counting the ones they saved. They hide from recognition because they believe they do not deserve it." She squeezed his hands tighter. "That is you, Grandpa. That has always been you. You did not talk about your service because you were ashamed of surviving. But surviving was not a betrayal. Surviving was a gift you have wasted by hiding from the people who love you. Vernon stared at his granddaughter, at the soldier she had become, at the words she had spoken that cut through 50 years of calcified guilt like a blade through fog. Behind them, someone in the audience began to clap. A single pair of hands, slow and deliberate. Then another joined, and another. The applause built like rolling thunder, spreading through the ballroom until the crystal chandeliers trembled with the sound. Vernon looked around at the standing crowd, at the phones still recording, at the tears on faces he did not know. He looked at General Vance, who was nodding slowly with something like satisfaction. He looked at Webb, who stood at attention with pride radiating from every line of his body. And he looked at Captain Thornberry, who had finally pushed away from the wall and was walking toward him with the shattered expression of a man about to do the hardest thing he had ever done. The applause continued as Thornberry stopped in front of Vernon. The captain's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then his knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor at Vernon's feet. Captain Thornberry knelt on the ballroom carpet with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking. The applause had died into stunned silence as the crowd watched the young officer collapse at Vernon's feet. "Master Sergeant," Thornberry said. His voice came out broken, barely recognizable as the same voice that had dripped contempt in the hotel lobby. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." Vernon looked down at the captain, at the pressed uniform and the West Point ring and the tears that had begun streaming down his face. The arrogance that had radiated from him an hour ago had vanished completely, replaced by something raw and devastated. Vernon's hands trembled at his sides. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the pressure of judgment waiting to be rendered. This man had accused him of stolen valor, had tried to throw him out of his own granddaughter's ceremony, had called him confused and pathetic, and a dozen other things that still echoed in Vernon's memory. But Vernon had seen men break before, had held them in the mud and the blood and the chaos of combat when the weight became too much, had learned that cruelty often came from ignorance, and that ignorance was not the same as evil. "Stand up, son," Vernon said quietly. Thornberry shook his head without lifting it. "I cannot. What I said to you, what I did, there is no excuse. I looked at you, and I saw nothing. I saw an old man who did not belong. I did not see a soldier. I did not see a hero. I saw nothing." Vernon reached down with his trembling hand and touched the captain's shoulder. The contact was gentle, almost fatherly. "I know," Vernon said. "That is what I wanted you to see." Thornberry finally looked up. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red and swollen. "What do you mean?" Vernon sighed. The sound carried decades of exhaustion. "I have spent 50 years trying to be invisible," he said, "trying to disappear into the background, trying to make sure no one looked at me long enough to ask questions. You saw exactly what I wanted the world to see. An old man with trembling hands who did not matter. But you do matter," Thornberry said. His voice cracked on the words. "You matter more than I will ever matter. What you did at Hugh City, the men you saved, that is real. That is important. And I almost threw you out of a building because I was too arrogant to look past your appearance." Vernon studied the young captain for a long moment. He thought about the anger he could hold on to, the righteous indignation that would be justified, the satisfaction of watching this man suffer for his cruelty. But he had carried enough weight for one lifetime. He did not need to add more. "Stand up," Vernon said again. This time it was not a request. Thornberry rose slowly on unsteady legs. He stood at attention, shoulders back, chin up, the posture of a soldier awaiting judgment. "You made a mistake," Vernon said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent ballroom. "You made a mistake based on what you saw and what you assumed. That is something every person in this room has done at some point in their lives." He paused, letting the words settle. "The question is not whether you made a mistake," Vernon continued. "The question is what you do next. Do you learn from it? Do you let it change how you see people? Do you remember this moment the next time you look at someone and think you know their story based on how they appear?" Thornberry swallowed hard. "Yes, Master Sergeant. I will remember. I swear I will remember." Vernon nodded slowly. "Then we are done here. You made your apology. I accepted it. There is no need for anything more." He turned away from Thornberry and looked at General Vance, who had been watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. "General," Vernon said. His voice was stronger now, steadier. "I appreciate what you have done here today, but I did not come for recognition. I did not come for apologies. I came to watch my granddaughter become an officer." Vance nodded slowly. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Then perhaps," the general said, "we should let her grandfather pin on her lieutenant's bars." Elena's breath caught audibly. She looked at Vance, then at Vernon, then back at the general. "Sir," she said, "that would normally be done by a family member who has served." Vance's smile widened. "Lieutenant Calloway, I believe your grandfather qualifies." Vernon stared at the general. The request was unexpected, overwhelming. He looked down at his trembling hands, at the fingers that would not stay still no matter how hard he willed them. "General," he said slowly, "I'm not certain I can. My hands." Elena stepped forward and took his hands in hers again. She had done this 3 times now, steadying him with her grip. But this time she did not just hold them. She lifted them up between them and looked at them directly. "These hands," she said softly, "carried wounded men across open ground. These hands held a position for 38 hours. These hands saved 32 lives." She looked up at her grandfather with tears still glistening on her cheeks. "These hands can pin on my bars," she said. "I do not care if they tremble. I want them to tremble, because every shake will remind me of what you sacrificed, what you carried, what you survived." Vernon felt something break loose inside his chest, a knot that had been tied for 50 years suddenly unraveling. His vision blurred with tears he had not allowed himself to shed since Martha's funeral. "Elena," he whispered. His voice cracked on her name. She smiled through her own tears. "Please, Grandpa, let them see who you really are. Let me see who you really are. Not just today. Every day from now on." Vernon looked at his granddaughter, at the lieutenant who stood before him with strength and grace, and a love so fierce it burned through his defenses like sunlight through fog. He thought of Martha, of her voice asking him to tell Elena the truth, of all the years he had wasted in silence when he could have had this connection, this understanding, this family that wanted him not despite his trembling hands, but because of everything those hands represented. "All right," Vernon said finally. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried. "All right." General Vance gestured toward the stage. The colonel who had been frozen at the podium stepped aside as Vernon and Elena walked forward together. Webb fell in a step behind them, an honor guard of one. And as they walked up the center aisle, past rows of officers and families and strangers who had witnessed something none of them would ever forget, the ballroom erupted into applause once more. Vernon's hands trembled with every step, but for the first time in 50 years, he did not try to hide them. The stage felt impossibly vast beneath Vernon's orthopedic shoes. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the wooden podium and the flags that hung in solemn rows behind it. He stood beside Elena in front of hundreds of faces, his trembling hands clutching the small box that contained her lieutenant's bars. General Vance had handed him the box moments before with a nod that carried the weight of recognition between soldiers. Now Vernon stared at the brass insignia inside, at the single gold bars that would mark his granddaughter as an officer in the United States Army. His hands shook so violently that the bars rattled against the velvet lining. Elena stood at attention before him, her chin lifted and her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. She had removed the temporary insignia from her shoulders, leaving bare patches of fabric waiting to be filled. The ballroom had fallen into reverent silence. Even the soft music that had played throughout the ceremony had stopped. Every phone was raised. Every eye was fixed on the trembling old man and the young lieutenant who faced each other on that stage. Vernon lifted one of the bars from the box. His fingers would not cooperate. The brass slipped, and he nearly dropped it, catching it at the last moment against his palm. "Take your time," Elena whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Vernon looked at his granddaughter, at the strength in her stance and the love in her eyes. She was not embarrassed by his trembling. She was not impatient with his struggle. She was simply waiting, as steady as the line he had held 50 years ago. He positioned the bar against her right shoulder. His hands shook so badly that he could not align the pins with the holes in her uniform. He tried once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt brought the pins close, but not close enough. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The silence of the ballroom pressed against him like a physical weight. He was failing at this simple task in front of hundreds of witnesses, failing his granddaughter on the most important day of her career. Then Elena's hands rose and covered his own. Together, she said softly, "We do this together." Her fingers guided his, steadying the tremors just enough to align the pins. Together, they pressed the bar into place. The brass gleamed against her shoulder, perfectly positioned. Vernon exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. "One down," Elena said. Her smile was radiant despite the tears that had begun to fall. "Want to go?" They repeated the process with the second bar. Vernon's hands still trembled violently, but Elena's grip kept them steady enough to complete the task. When the final pins slid into place, she released his hands and snapped to attention. The ballroom erupted. The applause was thunder. It was a wave crashing against rocks. It was every sound Vernon had tried to avoid for 50 years suddenly surrounding him with force he could not escape. People were standing. Officers in dress uniforms. Families in their finest clothes. Strangers who had come to watch other ceremonies and stayed to witness this one. They were all on their feet, clapping and cheering, and some of them openly weeping. Vernon stood frozen on the stage, overwhelmed by the noise and the attention and the reality of what had just happened. He had pinned his granddaughter's bars. He had stood in front of hundreds of people with his trembling hands on display. He had let them see. Elena turned to face the crowd, then turned back to her grandfather. She raised her right hand to her forehead in a crisp salute. "Second Lieutenant Elena Calloway," she said. Her voice rang clear through the ballroom. "Reporting for duty, Master Sergeant." Vernon stared at her, at the salute she was rendering, at the title she had used. She was not saluting him as her grandfather. She was saluting him as a soldier. Aza superior, as the man who had earned that recognition through blood and sacrifice and 38 hours of hell. His trembling hand rose slowly to return the salute. It was imperfect, just as it had been when he saluted Vance. His fingers shook and his alignment was off, and none of it mattered. None of it mattered at all. The applause somehow grew louder. From the VIP section, Vernon's son-in-law Thomas had risen to his feet with an expression of shock on his face. Beside him, Elena's mother Linda was sobbing into her handkerchief. They had not known. All these years of keeping Vernon at arm's length because they thought he was just a quiet old man with nothing to say, and they had not known. General Vance stepped forward and shook Vernon's hand. The general's grip was firm, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "Master Sergeant Calloway," Vance said. His voice carried through the microphone on the podium. "On behalf of the United States Army, I want to thank you for your service. And I want you to know that effective immediately, I am personally reopening the inquiry into your Medal of Honor nomination." Vernon blinked. The words did not register at first. Medal of Honor. The nomination that had been lost. The recognition he had never pursued. "Sir," Vernon said. His voice was barely audible. "That is not necessary." Vance shook his head firmly. "It is long overdue. What you did at Hughes City deserves to be recognized officially. Your country failed you once by losing that paperwork. We will not fail you again." The applause continued as Vance guided Vernon and Elena back toward the center of the stage. Webb had appeared with a chair, positioning it so Vernon could sit if he needed to. The consideration was not lost on Vernon, though he remained standing. In the audience, Captain Thornberry had not moved from where he stood near the back wall. His face was still pale, still wet with tears. But something had changed in his expression. The horror had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like resolve. He would remember this day. He would remember the old man with trembling hands who had shown him what real service looked like. And he would spend the rest of his career trying to live up to that example. The ceremony continued around Vernon like a dream. More names were called. More oaths were administered. But the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Every officer who crossed that stage glanced toward the trembling old man seated in the place of honor. Every family member looked at their own veterans with new eyes. Elena stayed beside her grandfather throughout, her hand resting on his shoulder. She leaned close to his ear during a pause in the proceedings. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me see you." Vernon placed his trembling hand over hers. "Thank you for asking," he said. His voice cracked. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Elena smiled through her tears. "Never," she said. "I am a Calloway. We do not give up on our people." Vernon closed his eyes. The weight he had carried for 50 years was still there. The names of the 7 men he had lost. The face of Elias Drummond dying in his arms. The guilt that would never fully fade. But somehow, in this moment, the weight felt lighter, because he was no longer carrying it alone. 3 months had passed since the ceremony at the Grand Americana Hotel. The leaves had turned gold and red outside the window of Elena's apartment near Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division, home of the Screaming Eagles, home, in a way Vernon had never expected, of a unit that had shaped him 55 years ago. Vernon sat in an armchair by the window, watching the autumn light filter through the curtains. His hands still trembled against the armrests, but something about the shaking felt different now. Less like a punishment, more like a reminder. Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one on the table beside her grandfather, carefully positioning the handle so he could grip it without spilling. "Ready to continue?" she asked. Vernon nodded. On the coffee table between them sat a small digital recorder. Elena had been documenting his stories for weeks now, building an archive of memories he had kept locked away for half a century. "Where were we?" Vernon asked. His voice was stronger than it had been 3 months ago. Regular conversation had rebuilt muscles that silence had allowed to atrophy. Elena settled onto the couch across from him and checked her notes. "You were telling me about Elias. About the day you met him." Vernon closed his eyes. The memory came easier now, less like a wound being reopened and more like a photograph being taken from a drawer. "Fort Campbell," he said. "Summer of 1967. He was fresh out of training, skinny as a rail, could not have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet. They assigned him to me as my radio man because nobody else wanted the new kid." Elena smiled softly. "But you wanted him." Vernon opened his eyes. "I did not want anyone. I had already lost one radio man at DAC 2. I did not want to learn another name. Did not want to care about another kid who might not make it home." He paused, his trembling hands curling around the coffee cup Elena had placed beside him. "But Elias would not let me keep my distance," Vernon continued. "He was relentless. Talked constantly. Asked questions about everything. Told me about his girl back home, about his plans to become a teacher, about the book he was reading that week. He made it impossible not to know him." "What book?" Elena asked gently. Vernon's lips curved into a faint smile. "A Tale of Two Cities." He was reading it for the 3rd time when we deployed to Hugh. He said Dickens understood something about sacrifice that most people missed. He lifted the coffee cup with both hands, steadying it enough to take a small sip. "Elias used to say that the ending of that book was the most hopeful thing he had ever read," Vernon said. "A man giving his life so someone else could live. He thought that was beautiful. I thought he was naive." Elena waited, knowing there was more. Vernon set the cup down carefully. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Elias understood better than I did. When he stepped in front of that bullet, when he kept transmitting coordinates with his last breath, he was not being naive. He was being exactly who he had always been, someone who believed that sacrifice meant something." The recorder captured every word, every pause, every tremor in Vernon's voice. Elena reached across and touched her grandfather's knee. "He will be proud of you," she said, "for finally telling these stories." Vernon shook his head slowly. "He will be proud of you," he said. "The Screaming Eagles. His unit. Our unit. He would have loved knowing that a Calloway was still serving with them." Elena smiled. She had requested Fort Campbell specifically. The assignment board had been surprised by her insistence, but she had not explained her reasons. Some things were personal. A knock came at the door. Elena rose to answer it, revealing Command Sergeant Major Webb standing in the hallway with a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Sergeant Major," Elena said, "please come in." Webb entered and nodded respectfully toward Vernon. "Master Sergeant, I hope I'm not interrupting." Vernon gestured to an empty chair. "Seat. You're always welcome." Webb settled into the chair and placed the manila folder on the coffee table. He was quiet for a moment, as though gathering himself for what came next. "I have news," Webb said finally. "The review board met yesterday. They examined all the surviving records from Hugh City. Statements from the 32 men you saved. Testimonies that were never properly filed in 1968. Vernon's trembling hands went still in his lap. Webb opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper bearing an official Army letterhead. "Master Sergeant Vernon Calloway," Webb said. His voice carried the formal cadence of an official pronouncement. "It is my honor to inform you that the Secretary of the Army has approved the recommendation to award you the Medal of Honor for actions above and beyond the call of duty on January 31st through February 2nd, 1968, in Hugh City, Republic of Vietnam." The room went silent. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Vernon stared at Webb without moving, without breathing, without fully comprehending the words. "The ceremony will be held at the White House," Webb continued. "The President will present the medal personally. Your family will be invited to attend." Vernon found his voice at last. It emerged as a whisper. "I do not need a medal. I never needed a medal." Webb leaned forward. "Master Sergeant, this medal is not for you. It is for the 32 men who came home because of what you did. It is for their children and grandchildren who exist because you held that line. It is for Elias Drummond and the other 6 who gave everything, so their sacrifice is remembered properly." He paused, his eyes bright with emotion. "And it is for every veteran who sees an old man with trembling hands and wonders if anyone remembers what those hands once did," Webb said. "You will show them that we remember, that we will always remember." Vernon looked at Elena, at the tears streaming down her face, at the lieutenant's bars on her shoulders that he had pinned with these same trembling hands. He thought of Martha, of her voice asking him to tell their granddaughter the truth, of all the years he had wasted in silence, and of these past 3 months when he had finally begun to speak. "All right," Vernon said. His voice cracked, but held. "All right." Elena crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, wrapping her arms around him. Vernon held her with trembling hands that had once carried wounded men through fire, that had held a dying boy from Ohio, that had kept a line for 38 hours against impossible odds. Hands that had finally stopped hiding. Webb stood and moved toward the door, giving them privacy. But he paused at the threshold and looked back. "Master Sergeant," he said, "your country is proud of you. We should have told you that 50 years ago." Vernon nodded, unable to speak past the tears that had begun to fall. When the door closed behind Webb, Elena pulled back and looked at her grandfather. His face was wet, his hands were shaking, and he was smiling for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. "Grandpa," Elena said softly, "will you tell me more about Elias? About the others? I want to know all of them." Vernon wiped his eyes with trembling fingers. He looked at the recorder still running on the coffee table, at the window where autumn light painted the walls gold, at his granddaughter in her screaming Eagles uniform, carrying forward a legacy he had almost let die in silence. "Yes," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "I will tell you everything." And so he did. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in disguises we too often overlook, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments who is the quiet hero in your family, whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones whose battles we never saw. Sometimes the strongest hands are the ones that tremble. Thank you for watching.